All right, so we've just heard that matters have wrapped at the High Court in Pietermaritzburg. Judgment has been reserved until Friday morning at 11 o'clock, so no decision today. Let's get some reaction on the day's proceedings. I'm joined now by Tyrone Maseko, legal expert at T Maseko Attorneys. Thank you so much for joining us, Tyrone. So the news just in now that judgment has been reserved until Friday at 11. Does this mean that the former president needs to be arrested in the meantime or not?
Good evening, Sally. Well, you're going to get different questions, different answers depending on which of the parties you speak to. So the legal position is this, is that there's currently an order, the Constitutional Court order. That order is very clear in its terms as to what must happen by, I think, midnight tomorrow. Now, there has not been an order, a subsequent order that overturns that, and there are question marks as to whether there can actually be an order specifically granted by the High Court, which can overturn that. That's what today's proceedings were about. But in any event, as I understand it, now that judgment has not been granted, the order of the Constitutional Court has not in any way been averted, and so it stands.
And yet, in the meantime, earlier today, we heard the news that the police minister and the police commissioner basically said, well, we're going to hold off on doing anything until this matter is resolved. And advocate Thembeka Nxukaitoba basically saying, well, they can't make that call. Helen Suzman Foundation saying exactly the thing. So are we likely to see more confusion?
Well, that's really unfortunate. I mean, I don't know how the police ministry arrives at a decision like that. And to start with, I found it odd that they write a letter to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court, when it handed down a judgment and its orders, was effectively, that is a judicial process, and they themselves are then effectively functus officios, which means they've carried out their duties as legal officers. The Constitutional Court itself is not in a position to write back to the police ministry to clarify its order or otherwise give directives to them. Because what is the standing of those directives? Those directives cannot override the order in which it was made in court. And so that to me is a non-starter. It's quite unfortunate that they went that way. I'm quite surprised, especially given that, they should have legal advice on this thing, that they really should have stayed out of it and retained the position that they will carry out the Constitutional Court's order.
All right. So from what you're telling us, essentially what the Constitutional Court has ordered stays. In other words, come midnight on Wednesday, the police should have arrested him and sent him to prison in the meantime. So it's going to be a very interesting 24 hours, Tyrone. Let's deal with what came out of the Pietermaritzburg High Court. First of all, if you could just summarize for you what was the most important aspects of what Advocate Dalian Mpofu was arguing on behalf of the former president. We knew it might be around jurisdiction, and, was it more than just, well, this court does have the jurisdiction? What did you hear that for you was thought-provoking and interesting and relevant?
It's all actually very interesting. The unfortunate part about it is that I can appreciate that it can be very difficult for the public to follow completely, because a lot of it is actually caught up in legalese, and you have to have understanding of legal principles in order to fully appreciate. But let's try and explain it very briefly. So the starting point, I guess, would be to explain jurisdiction. Jurisdiction, and this is for non-lawyers out there, lawyers will understand this very well. Jurisdiction essentially is the question of standing, you put it differently, is power, authority to do something. So remember that we've got a hierarchy in our law of different courts, starting with the district court to regional courts, high courts, Supreme Court of Appeal, and the Constitutional Court. Now, all those different courts have their own mandates and power. For example, magistrates' courts are creatures of statute. Every single thing that magistrates do, they derive their powers from the act. They cannot do anything outside of that. That's why you cannot go to the magistrate court and ask for certain orders, because they simply don't have the jurisdiction to grant those. The High Court is an interesting one because it has what we call inherent jurisdiction, so which means basically they can give just about any order that is lawful. And I say just about every order that is lawful carefully because it's not strictly speaking true. But for the most part, there is a court that can actually give you relief. And the Supreme Court of Appeal really deals with appeals. And then you've got this, the Constitutional Court is the Constitutional Court. We're not going to go into details about it. But the point is that that hierarchy is very important to accept. Why? Because no higher court can be overridden by a lower court. So what has happened now is the Constitutional Court has granted judgment. Then Mpofu wants to argue that, hold on, what we're dealing with here is not an appeal. We're not asking the higher courts to change the decision of the Constitutional Court. What we're asking for is an interdict, and the high courts have inherent jurisdiction to hear any interdict, and that is why we want them to hear this interdict. And the reason we want them to hear this interdict is because this interdict actually really relates to the powers that are going to be carried out, the orders that are going to be carried out by the police.
I see. So he's not saying really that what's happening in the High Court is any attempt to trump the Constitutional Court. It's more about an interdict. Well, am I understanding it correctly?
That's what they want to say, yeah. That's why I'll get to what Muratobi says, but that's what they want to argue. It's false, though. I mean, there's a problem with that argument. But on its face, that is the argument. They say, no, forget all of this. Actually, what we're doing is that these parties have been given powers to do X, Y, Z. We simply want to get an order that tells these parties that you cannot do X, Y, Z. Well, the problem with that is this, twofold. And that's what Muratobi wants to argue and Max du Plessis, is that, hold on, the order that's been granted by the Constitutional Court is lawful. So there's no challenge to the lawfulness of that order, and that order has also been granted by a far superior court. So this court has actually got no jurisdiction to overturn or to do anything to interfere with the court, with that order, and that is why you hear him talk about even inferior courts, even the High Court cannot interfere with the orders or on the affairs of magistrates courts, for example. So how much more then can you have the High Court interfering with an order of the apex court, because it would make a mockery of our judicial system and the hierarchy that we have.
All right, I have to ask you, just to summarize in a nutshell, what Advocate Untitled and du Plessis had to say for us.
Well, that's essentially what they're saying. They're saying, look, this court has got no power to interfere with the order of the Constitutional Court, just because that by design, that is how our system works. Otherwise, we really make a mockery of this hierarchy that we have. And that's what, Judge Mnguni is going to have to sit and decipher. But I mean, for me, it's straightforward, really. It just makes absolutely no sense that the High Court can interfere. Because when we talk about interfere, we're not talking about interference. We're talking about substantial interference. So in substance, not in nebulous law, trying to plug this law and that law and that. We're talking about in effect. What is the effect of a decision? If the High Court were to make the decision to actually interdict this, the effect of it is that it would have effectively stayed an order of the Constitutional Court, which has got no power to do.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that summary. Tyrone Maseko, legal expert at T Maseko Attorneys. Well,